All right. Thank you for being here. Poet Jeffrey Charles Fleming. How do you write a poem?
Ooh, great question. Um, I have a for me, it's very based on emotional responses. Sometimes when I'm out in nature, um, so if something that makes me tear up and a few words come to me, I just start writing and then go from there based off whatever the feeling is that I'm writing about, or whatever the topic is. Um, I was writing something the other day, um, just about like I was thinking about my mom. Um, I lost my mom a couple of years ago, and so like I was trying to figure out process when do you kind of like let go of someone when you've lost someone. And so that was kind of what the poem was. I was just like writing to figure that out, and it just kept coming. I like to reuse words, so I'm also an actor. So I like to like I like my words to kind of either have opposites or maybe like reuse them, a repetitive thing. So that's kind of how I write a poem.
When you're writing it down, do you take like a notepad with you, or are you taking notes in your phone, or how do
Sometimes
you?
I'm writing. Sometimes I'm writing in my phone. Sometimes I'm writing in my little notebook here. It just whenever it comes, depending on which one is closest to me, my phone or my notepad.
Do you end up with a lot of completed poems from that, or do you have like a couple lines here and there from a thought that came to you, and then later you have to put it all together?
Typically, I try to have a completed poem, just because I know if I try and come back to it, I'll be like, "What was I talking about? What caused this? Where did this come from?" Sometimes I might. I have had a few where I've started, and I haven't. It's just hard to pick it back up for me. So I definitely need to like try and complete it while I have that flow in the moment.
Do you do a lot of like revision later on? Like I know you have the poetry book. Do you write
Yeah,
the poem and then set it aside and come back later to it and do little tweaks, or
I
either way?
have, but I need some external support with that just because I'm one of those people like when I write something, I like what I wrote. I feel very confident in what I wrote, and so I don't feel like changing it. But like if somebody else gives some kind of feedback as to why something might be a little stronger choice, I'll take that feedback. Because like when I was working on my poetry book, I worked with someone who was editing some of my poems to just give some feedback on it. So one of the things he was like, maybe you should, change some words to be a little bit more general. Um, expand on something here a little bit. And one of the comments he gave was like, "Your poems are great, but you just keep stopping yourself so they could be longer." And I'm like, "Yeah, but that's all I had to say in the moment. And I don't really, I don't have much else to say. Like, if I once I've written it, um, it's done in my brain. So I definitely am working to grow to edit poems.
Hmm. How do you know then when a poem is done?
I won't say that they are done. Um, so I'm reading right now. I'm reading Audre Lorde's Undersong book, and it's like all of her revised poems. So she like went back and revised these poems. Um, and so reading the intro, one of the things that she said was like her poems are not done, but for me, it feels done when I just don't have any more to say in the moment. Um, I've come up with as many creative ways to express the thought that I'm feeling or the emotion that I'm feeling. That's when I feel like it's ready-ish for
Mhm.
other people to see. Um, yeah.
Yeah, for me, writing a book or a story is different than a poem. And
Hmm.
like when I think of someone editing, like if I put in a poetry book and someone's editing it, I will listen to suggestions on editing poems much less than I will listen to suggestions on editing a
Mm,
story, just
hmm.
because I think that poem is something different than writing a regular story. So
Yeah.
if I'm putting a book together and I'm doing a bunch of drafts and I talk to people about it and think about it more and change things around, eventually it becomes the point where you're not really changing what you're saying, you're just changing
Mhm.
you're saying it.
Yep.
So with writing a book, I get to the point where you read it 20 times and you're like, okay, that's it. I'm finished with it. Maybe it's not done. Maybe there could be stuff added to it. I don't know if I'd ever go back later and do that, but I think it's done and it's ready to be released into the world as its own.
Mhm.
But with poetry, I think I get to that point much quicker when if I'm starting to like, well, let me change this word and this word. Now you're just saying the same thing in a different way, or
Mhm.
you really ruin it because you've messed with it too much, and
Mhm.
you're like, okay, I don't want to kill the poem. So I, I think it's to me, a different living type thing than a
Yeah.
story. And I'm not sure why that is, but I think it might come from a different place, like poetry
Yeah.
from a different place than a story. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
One of my first thoughts is like for me, poetry I associate it with music, and so it's like it's it has its own rhythm to it, and
Mm.
so if you change a word or two, it has to fit that right rhythm that you have in the entire poem. Because if you change that word or two, then you've lost the rhythm, you've lost the flow of the poem. So I think that that's like very important to think about when you're if you're editing a poem. It's like how do I change this without throwing off what I have here as a piece. Um, and for me, editing, excuse me, editing any kind of written work has always been very challenging for me, especially when it comes to creative writing, because I'm married to my babies, like I really am, and so it's like I'm gonna fight you on this word choice if you wanted to, if you think it needs to be changed, because I'm like I really know it doesn't. A couple of books that I've read lately, or one of the books I've read lately, um, there's been some internet discussion about some of how the book flows, and like, well, this is the author's work, and if you wanted to, have it be your way, you go write your story your way. Everybody has their own unique voice and expression in how they're writing, and so somebody that, and I think it's important that you have an editor that understands you and your voice. Um, I think that's very key. Um, but I lost my train of thought just now.
That's all
But
right. The
yeah, I think it's important
perhaps
to.
perhaps a poem is different because it is more emotional because it's
Mm,
all the emotion of a story compacted down into much less, and
yeah.
you're dealing with maybe not a smaller idea, but an idea expressed more like concentrated. So
Hmm.
then with a poem, if somebody's editing it and they say, hey, you put through instead of thought, you need to change that word. Now, if I meant to do it the wrong way, then I meant
Hmm.
to. But if it's the wrong word, yes, that's the type of editing I'm looking for. I don't want
Hmm.
it to be the wrong word.
Right.
But it's it's that a poem is so much shorter than a story. I think it's more of, look, just listen to this and experience this little piece. It's not like you're trying to keep the person's attention for a whole story. So I can
Right.
understand the more of the editing where you say, look, this story's not tracking. Nobody's going to read past the first
Hmm.
paragraph. You go, oh,
Hmm.
okay. Well, maybe I need to listen to that a lot more and make it accessible. But a poem, and a poem can be inaccessible, I'm sure, because it can be strangely written and people just don't understand it and they don't want to
Hmm.
put the work in to understanding it. But it could also be really too simple too, to the point where you're like, oh, this is very what's the point of this poem? It's very shallow. So
Mm,
I don't know. I think that's one of the big difference for poetry and writing to me. But
yeah.
where do you think that inspiration of poetry comes from? Do you think it comes from within us, outside of us, a mix? What do you think?
Definitely a mix. Um, I like life. The way I look at it, like I was outside yesterday, doing yoga, and then I was on a cruise, and I I had my book with me, and I was like definitely want to write some poetry, but looking at just the beauty of the outdoors, that's poetry in and of itself. Like there's nothing in the world, there's no things in the world that are two things alike in that way, unless you made a copy on a copy machine. But there are so much to express about just what's outside, and I think that's the other thing about poetry that I love too is like going out in nature to just like observe and then write down what you see out there because it can connect to something that's happening in your personal world or in in your world, um, and you can write a poem from that. So that's that outside and inside piece that we have things coming up we don't even know, and we might need to see it externally to kind of bring it out of us in that way.
Is there a way that you get into that state of mind of writing poetry?
What do you mean?
Like if you're going to say today I'm, or you have a goal, like if you say I'm going to write a poetry book, so I wonder how many poems I need for that and how long it's going to take me. It's not
Mm,
like you can sit down and, I mean, I guess some people could sit down and write 100 poems, in an afternoon. That when I'm writing poetry books, I think I'm going to try to write 10 poems a month is my goal. And
mhm,
sometimes I go more than that. Sometimes I go less.
mhm,
Sometimes there's only a few that are the type I would publish. So
mhm.
it's, how do you get to that point where you're like, okay, now I'm going to write a poem?
um I haven't really got to that place of like pushing myself to writing poetry yet. Um, but I think it is going to happen soon. I teach, and so I'm on summer break right now. So I'm kind of scheduling my life out each day to have some sense of uh, routine and scheduling. And I think that is something I'm going to work towards, like trying because my next poetry book I'm working on now. Um, I'm not saying. I don't want to say it yet. But I am starting to compile poems for my next poetry book, and I know that I'm definitely going to want more poems for it, um, based off the number I have now, which is like 20 something. So I definitely need a lot more. I don't have a goal in mind yet, but I might make one. But I think it's intention. If you're planning to write, make a book, um, I think you need to put your mind to it and like say, okay, I need to, like you said, 10 poems a month, or three a week, or whatever your intention is, your goal is. Definitely like continue to push forward, and everything that you write may not be in that published piece. It might be like, scrap it. It might be for something else later down the line. um,
Mhm.
some things that I reviewed when I was kind of compiling the ones that I have now, I was like, oh yeah, this doesn't go where I thought it would go. So save it for another poem, for another book. Um, yeah, and it might be something that you revisit years later and be like, oh, I could tweak that, edit that. Once I get into that tweaking and edit phase, for sure.
Yeah. I think that I don't recall, other than maybe in school when you had an assignment of write a poem about this or write a poem, that
Hmm.
maybe I would sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to write a poem. I think it's something that occurs to you whenever it is ready to occur to you. So
Hmm.
that's why you have to be ready to write those things down
Yep.
when they do, whether it's
Yep.
in the middle of the night, in the middle of the grocery store, wherever. You've got to stop for
Yeah.
that moment and write that down.
Yeah.
How and I think that once you forget a few of those times where you think, I'm going to remember this line, so I'll write it when I get up, or I'll remember it when I get back to the car.
Yep.
It only takes a few times to learn, oh, I'm not going to remember that. So I need
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
I need to write that down when it occurs. And maybe that's the difference between people that are poets and people that aren't, is maybe everybody has the propensity for poetry, but
Hmm.
they just don't give it the attention it needs.
Hmm.
So you just say, oh, that's an interesting thought. That's an interesting line. And then it just goes away
Yeah.
into wherever.
Yep.
But if you capture it and then you put it down and then you can think about it later, how do you deal with those situations where you know that you're not going to remember and you have to get it down?
I say it aloud and I say it in my head 3 times for sure because that kind of solidifies it.
Mm.
I wish I had done that yesterday because I had a great line when I was doing yoga, like with my, and I don't know what the line was, but I know it's like my hands in the grass. It's like real grass. It's like, wow, this feels great to do yoga in grass. But doing saying it out loud 3 times or saying it in my head 3 times until I get to my phone or to my notepad is how I kind of solidify the line before I lose it because there have been several times recently where I've like had something come to mind. I'm like, oh no, I lost it, and I really don't like
Mm.
that feeling because it definitely is
Yeah.
like that. It's that creative genius that's like, oh, it's there, it's there, it's there. I know I got something good. This line, and then boom, it goes into the abyss and like, please come back to me one day.
Yeah, and it might, and I have a lot of
Hmm.
poetry I've written myself about that very thing,
Mm,
about trying to connect with that creativity of poetry,
mhm,
and the way I was thinking about it recently, just before, we started recording this, I'm thinking about what we would talk about and what I think about poetry and all that, and I think that I would explain that little spark like a candle or a match.
mm,
And the noise around me is like the wind. So
mm.
that thought occurs to you, whether you lit it or something else lit it,
Yeah.
or the perfect chain of events happened and then it's unlocked to you or whatever, that you have this line and you're like, oh, that's a good idea. And now you gotta protect it from the noise around you until you can get it into a more state where you can think about it and deal with it. And yeah, I like that motif. And then I'm thinking, well, the flame is hot. And Jack Remick is a poet I've talked to before on
Mhm.
the podcast, and he called it chasing the heat. When
Ooh,
you're in that creative
I like
thing of
that.
whether you're
Yeah.
writing, whatever you're writing, poetry, stories, essays, you're chasing that creative idea. You're staying close to the heat. And I like that. And it goes along with that motif of the idea is that little sparked candle or match, and you got to
Yeah,
protect it. So it's,
definitely.
do you think then, if poetry comes from within us and outside of us, and I think that's the case because I can tell if I'm pushing it versus
Mm,
it's out there being revealed,
mhm,
like you're working as the antenna for something,
mhm,
that I wonder if the way you get into the state of mind of poetry is by just showing up. You hear a lot of writers say you just have to show up every day, sit down,
yep,
don't get distracted, show up, and then it'll come to you. But when you're out there in the world, I think you connect with that creative source enough that that creative source then goes, oh, this is someone that pays attention to me. So I
mhm,
can communicate with them more. So you get more of it. And
yeah,
it's it's kind of the give and take on both sides, is because you're making yourself available for it and you're paying attention to it. And then they're whatever that is sending it or broadcasting it or whatever.
yeah.
What do you How do you feel about that source of creativity? Where do you think that, maybe here's a simpler question. If creativity is something that is out there in the world outside of us, and it can be manifest bias, but if it's out there on its own, what is it doing when we're not interacting with it?
Hmm. Okay, that just put like a whole picture in my head
Mm,
of
mm,
just like you were talking about the wind. Like it's the wind. It's flowing and it's just waiting to kind of be harnessed and caught in this space so it can like be captured and not captured to like captured so it can be molded into something,
mm,
um, whether it be a writing piece or some kind of artistic work. Um, yeah, and the vision I had initially when you were saying if creativity is just out there, it's just like thinking about um, it's like fairies and like their their dust that
Mhm.
trails behind them, just like all of that, just that magic in the air is wow. That really sends some
Yeah, I
shivers
think
through me.
it's
I
it's
like
it's
that.
out there and it wants to be seen and
Mhm,
realized, and you're not trying to capture it to put it in a cage. You're
mhm.
trying to capture it to be able to help it
Exactly.
be seen and realized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to not say. It's captured to be the cage, for sure.
Yeah. I envision creativity differently. Like, I think maybe it's best described as like the muse. So I think there is a poetry muse. I think there is a writing muse, probably a journalism one, curiosity, all those things, and they can work
Mhm.
together. But
Yeah.
I think when you are open yourself up to one more than the others, that's the one you get more of. So
Yeah.
if you're into the poetry, like a couple years ago, I was like, let me take all the poems I've ever written, see which ones are good enough to put in a book, and try to track it is kind of like a timeline of how I developed being able to receive poetry, write poetry, whatever. So it goes back to
Mhm,
high school, spans 20 or 30 years,
mhm.
and it's around 100 poems.
Hmm.
And when I write poems, I usually write the date and the time.
Okay.
So even if it's just a line. So if it's
Yeah.
a note, I put a date and a time with it, and then that helps me organize it. So in that first book, I put those dates and times with it, and I tried
I
to
like
do it
that.
in order. So it starts with high school stuff or pre-high school stuff, and then goes through adulthood. And I think that helps because as a poet, I would be interested in reading that just to see the development of that poet
Mm.
and see
Mhm.
how things change and how their writing changes, how their interactions are.
Yeah.
And for me reading it, it's interesting because I can look at it and I can feel all those same emotions
Mm.
and understand those things now. But I also see more than like you can write a poem and you write it from this certain perspective. And years later, you can read that same poem, understand all that feeling and those perspectives when you wrote it, but see something completely different as well. I
Yeah.
think that's the big magic of poetry. And I was reading that book actually called Big Magic,
Mm.
which is an interesting book. I haven't finished it, but anyway, it's I think that's what it is. It's connecting with it enough. So with poetry, I see it as a dark forest, not
Mm.
like a dark like pitch black and you can't see
Mhm.
anything,
Mhm.
but just you can't really see beyond close around you, maybe like a
Yeah.
twilight type forest.
Mhm.
So you're going through these pathways and something is there, that creative spirit is there. And I've never felt it as an evil thing. I
Mhm.
felt it
Mhm.
more as a benevolent thing. I'm not sure what it is. Is
Mhm.
it a parallel reality to ours and it's some poet on another side and we can't cross into each other's reality, but in this space in the middle, each person can go halfway in. So I think
Mhm.
of it like the woods because it separates things. So it's a forest. And you can only go halfway into a forest because once you go halfway in, you're coming out the other side.
Mhm.
So maybe you can meet that other creative force halfway in there. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's something completely different. I'd change or think about it different ways at different times.
Yeah.
But I do think when I'm visualizing creativity, especially for poetry, that's the place I go to in my mind. And it's interesting that it's tied in with nature because I think there is so much creative force in
Yeah.
nature
Oh, for sure.
that yeah, that's the connection with it. And you're just trying to experience it and say, I'm here to understand.
Mhm.
I don't know. But I do also come in to these thoughts of if creativity is personified as like a person, like the creative muse is a person, and they're just walking around their apartment with a robe on, eating cereal, waiting for me to notice them so they can then. So it's the imagery of it is interesting
Mm.
when you start thinking about creativity.
Yeah.
What do you think causes a lack of creativity in some people?
Hmm. My teacher brain is thinking about my students first, right?
Okay.
And so like seeing it from their end because I taught literacy third grade for the last 2 years. And so one of the units I did was poetry.
Okay.
And so watching them, some of them kind of struggle with it, and then watching some of them just like take off from there with poetry. And like I know one student last year, like I unlocked a world for her in poetry. But then seeing so many other students just be like, this thing, poetry, like
Mm,
um and so I'm thinking in that brain of like 'cause for me poetry growing up I never connected to it, like I didn't understand it, I didn't like it, but I was active, and so I think it was just I didn't understand how poetry worked yet.
mm,
So I just had to have those kind of, and I wasn't connected to myself emotionally to really know. But the original question is, why do some people kind of not tap into their creativity? I think it's kind of exposure is one. Um, because if you haven't kind of been exposed to anything that's silly, free, loosey goosey, artsy, creative, you're kind of like in that rigid space.
mm,
Um, I think that's one thing. And I think another thing is just kind of that confidence, self confidence, um, to not care what other people may think about what you're putting out as art. Because some people, I think they like again with my students, they get so consumed in I'm trying to do this to kind of please you as a teacher or try to get that good feeling vibes and support from their classmates, and if it doesn't come out the way they wanted to they just be like, "Ugh, forget it," and then still that confidence kind of continues to beat them up versus like express just the editing phase, the draft phase. Like it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. Everybody has their own entry point and time when they're going to get into their creative space. But and then the freedom. Some people don't feel they have that freedom to be creative. So I think it's all of that. Like you have to be exposed to different things artistically. Um, you have to have that confidence that like no matter what somebody says about it, it's good enough. If it's good enough for you, somebody else will value it, and then just that freedom
mm.
to express yourself. Um, and I think that's yeah.
Yeah, I like that what you said about if it means something to you, it's going to mean something to someone else. I agree.
Hmm.
You just got to find that audience. I
Hmm.
wonder if maybe the default reason to say a kid isn't open up to creativity as much is because maybe it's because they're in more of a survival mode than anything else. But I think that could be an adult too, is that
Hmm.
you're worried about survival versus you don't have the time to put into
Hmm.
feelings or connecting with something that might be unusual to connect with or not as easy to understand as the here and now right in front of us.
Yeah.
But to think that a kid isn't creative, I mean, I think life kind of stamps out the creativity in you.
It
That when
does.
you're a kid, you probably have more creativity or more connection with it. And maybe that's because if you're thinking about there's more to life than just here,
Hmm.
that we came from somewhere. And
Hmm.
if we came from somewhere and we're blocked from knowing or remembering it for some reason to experience this without knowing all that, is maybe as a kid you're closer to that pool of creativity you just came out of. So
Hmm.
then when you draw your dream house, you have a sliding board from the second story, a
Hmm.
rocket car and a rocket ship and all this other stuff going on with it. But as an adult, if you were drawing your dream house, you wouldn't have that stuff
Mm-mm.
most of the time. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
sure there's some adults that would still put that in there, but it's life
Definitely
has been stamped
me.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I would think Elon probably has, in his dream house, there's a, SpaceX tower behind it. That
Hmm.
makes sense. That
Hmm.
makes sense. But for the regular average person, they're probably not thinking, I'm going to have a sub pen in my basement so I
Mm.
can hop in my submarine whenever I want.
Hmm.
You're too busy with this reality that we're
Yep.
dealing with.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yeah. This reality can be heavy.
Maybe that's that whole thing of quieting the mind enough to be able to connect with it. Is
Yeah.
do you, and I maybe asked this question in a different way already, but what do you do to like quiet your mind from the noise to be able to connect with creativity and to get into that mindset or the ability to do poetry specifically?
I actually embrace the noise. Um, like I embrace the chaos. I embrace the noise because I've always been someone who works better when there's some sense of noise around me. Like there will be times where I have to kind of like hone in and buckle down, but like I need a little bit of noise in the background. I don't like I'm not into quiet that much. So it's very hard for me to be like sit down and be in the quiet. The quiet is too quiet is too heavy for me.
Mm,
It's weird. It's like very, very heavy for me. And I have to sit and be in my thoughts or be in my, mm-mm.
mm,
I embrace the noise. So that's where a lot of my stuff comes from. It's like I can be sitting at a concert and writing a poem at the same time. Like I could be in my classroom teaching and have a break and like, oh snap, this idea came. Boom, 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 boom. Like kids could be all over the place. Like I do embrace the noise. So like I'm in that vein. The noise is like that creativity flowing around, and I'm harnessing it.
mm. I
Yeah.
like that. That's a good idea. And I wonder if the quiet, where you said it was too heavy, that makes sense, is because then you're alone with those ideas. And I wonder if that's why, I'm not sure how it occurs to you, but I get a lot of ideas if I'm doing something where I'm doing physical work and not really thinking about it. So your
Hmm.
body is doing something, but your mind is available to do something else. Like if you're running, especially on a treadmill, because you don't have to worry about what's around the next corner. You're
Yeah.
kind of in this encapsulated little space. Or in the shower, I get a lot of good thoughts, and I
Mm.
think that might be because of the connection with water, but
Hmm.
also it's the you don't have anything else going on.
Hmm.
And then maybe when right before you're asleep, you get into the little haziness of sleep
Hmm.
and awake, or maybe in dreams as well, that you're opened up to that alone time, and therefore that space is going to be filled by something, and
Yeah.
it's your thoughts and other thoughts. So
Yeah. Yeah. I don't even know why. Like other than the fact that I'm an only child, but I've never liked alone time that much. Like even if I'm not, even if nobody's like in the proximity of me nearby, I just like they could be 100 feet down the way. As long as I know that there's another being there,
mm,
I feel safe. When I'm by myself, I don't always feel safe. It's so
hmm. Well, they say humans are herd animals, so
weird. Hmm.
maybe it's nice knowing there's other humans around. Yeah,
Yeah,
it would be lonely not knowing.
yeah.
Where do you write most of your poetry? Are you just out in the world when you're doing it, or do you sit down and do it to put it together? And
I'm out in the world. Yeah. I've had a few come while I'm at home, but most times I'm out and about, and then just something that fire gets lit, and It's like, all right, phone or again, notebook, let's go. Just whatever comes, comes.
How do you go from the notebook or the phone to your finished poem on whether you type it or you write it down?
Hmm.
How do you consolidate that?
Um, so with the ones I was just talking about for this next poetry book, I just copy and pasted them from what I have in my phone into like a Google Doc, and I have a folder for them. Excuse me. On Google Docs, and then naturally the ones that I have in my notebook, I'll just have to type up. So and I have to go through that again to see what's there. Um, but yeah, I just type them and put them in a folder to see what I have as a compilation, and then go from there.
Do you ever get to the point where you have so many notes that you feel a little overwhelmed by how much there is to transfer over or to go through?
No,
No. Okay.
no. And again, for me, I'm newer to poetry, so I'm just kind of enjoying this journey. This process is definitely been interesting and rewarding. Just to say I'm a poet.
What kind of poetic style would you say you write in?
That's how new I am to poem. Can you give me a few that you might think you're thinking
Oh,
about?
well, I
Yeah,
think
my brain is.
some is free verse. I mean,
Oh yeah.
not the style of poets, like not saying like
Okay, I got
sonnets
you.
or odes or anything like
Okay, I
that, but
got you.
more of, yeah, how would you describe your poetry to somebody?
Um, Free verse. Some every now and then there might be some that have a kind of rhyme scheme to them. Um, and then some of them, like I said, I like the call and response as well. Um, kind of poetry. Or like echo. So like it'll start and then it'll kind of repeat itself somewhere in there. Um, I think that's that music piece to me for the call and
Mhm.
response and the echoing. Yeah,
Yeah, like a chorus.
yeah.
Hmm. I wonder if the lyricism of poetry in music is connected with some sort of ethereal idea of, like, you always hear of angels being in choirs and singing, and I wonder if there's some sort of, whether it's the direct religious connection or if it's just some sort of thing that creative something is more attuned to music. Do you have any
Hmm.
thoughts on that?
Not really, but I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a
What do
connection.
you How do you measure success as a poet then?
Ooh, um, someone reading one of my poems or reading the poems and kind of like saying yes. Um, I I I I see where you're coming from with that, and kind of like giving their personal testimony in connection to a poem. I think that's the best feedback because that means that they understand the poem, that they connect to it. I definitely appreciate like that connection. Um, Recently, somebody was telling me that they read the poems and then they wanted to get share with their husband because I guess they're interracial couple, excuse me, and the husband is black, and they wanted them to read it and kind of get a sense of it because a lot of the poems in this first poetry book were inspired by things that happened starting in the pandemic, and especially with like um, Black Lives Matter movements with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. Like several poems are kind of focusing on those moments, and so uh, I think he was sharing that like he really wanted his husband to read it because he didn't know how to kind of talk to him during that time frame about what was
Mm.
happening, and he knew that his husband was kind of feeling things, just didn't know how to. They didn't know how to communicate about it, so that might be a great door opening for them to have, very healthy conversation about what happened and how his husband's been feeling about it and processing and dealing with it. So that connection is that's key to me. Um, you know, the more people's hands I can get, the more hands that what am I trying to say? The more people that can see the poems, the better to see that connection and understand that. But yeah, I think that's for me is that connection, understanding.
Hmm. Have you ever had somebody read one of your poems and like it and get something out of it that was totally different than you thought?
Possibly, I just don't recall what their response was from it. But yeah, I think
Okay.
I have.
Yeah, I think that's when, for me, when that happens, like I can write a poem and then go, okay, this is what this means to me, and someone
Hmm.
will say, what is this poem about? Because my poems are strange, but I I'm reluctant to explain them because
Hmm.
I don't want to change what they're going to get from it. And
Yeah,
if they get the same thing, I can go, okay, wow. If they
yeah,
get a different thing, I'm still interested in what the different thing is, because I
yeah,
think that's how that creativity is reaching out and interacting with them versus me, that it's a
yeah,
different thing.
yeah.
You hear a lot of people talk about writing that's like a living writing, like the living Bible or the Constitution, that's a living
Hmm.
document.
Hmm.
I understand that a little. I mean, I think there are times where stuff needs to be concrete, but I think there's also interesting times where you can hear something and it seems like you may have heard it before, read it before, but then it seems like it's specifically addressing a thing you're thinking about at that point. And
Yeah,
that's pretty interesting if writing can do that, whether it's a book
yeah,
or a poem or whatever.
definitely.
It probably songs, I would think, probably hits more people like that, because I think people listen to music more than they read poetry.
Hmm.
But you have songs that make you happy or that you like to listen to when you're driving or doing other things. And then one day you'll listen to it and go, wow, this is not what I normally listen to it as. And it's
Yep.
completely different meaning than I
Yeah.
normally thought of it.
Yeah. Definitely.
For a poet, I think of like a Robert Frost, or no, yeah, like a Walt Whitman book, where Leaves of Grass, where he came back and he keeps adding to it and revising it. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I guess I'm okay with it.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if I would do it, but that's okay.
Hmm.
And I read through that whole book and I go, well, there's a couple poems I like, and there's some lines that are memorable, but it's not like I'm reading every one going, oh, that's great. Oh, that's what's this next one? That's great.
Yep.
So then I developed this idea that if you can read a poetry book, however long it is,
Hmm.
and you like one or two poems in it, one or two poems out of 100, I would think as a poet, that's a success,
Hmm.
because you've connected with somebody on something
Hmm.
that they either think, I could frame that, or I could share that with somebody else.
Yeah.
Or even if it's not a poem, if it's just a line in one
Hmm.
that they
Hmm.
remember and
Hmm.
they'll say at certain times or think at certain times, I think that's the success of it. That
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be every one. So,
Yeah.
and then it goes back to what you were saying before of, if it means something to you, it's going to mean something to someone else. It's
Yeah.
just, will they ever see it? Do
Yeah.
you, are you going to get into that audience or not?
Yeah. That's key.
Hmm. With your teaching, how'd you get started in teaching?
Um. So I 16 years ago, I was in college and I was looking for a summer job and I got a job as a tutor for summer school. Um, and so that kind of was like an eye opener to me. And I was like, oh, I could do this teaching thing. And definitely back then, there was this push, and I think even still today, that there's a very big push for like more Black males in education. Um, and there was a student that I was working with, and she was reading something. We had taught worked on the strategies, and I think she was in kindergarten. We worked on the strategies, and she read something. She read part of it, and then she read one word, and I was like, well, "Where did that word come from?" And then I looked at where she kind of got that word from, because the word that was written was bear, but what she said was living room because she saw the bear in the living room in the picture. I was like, ah, okay, I could be in this profession because
Hmm.
I want to make those clarify, that kind of confusion for students. So that was when it started, and then I just continued to tutor, and then I graduated college and went and got my master's in special education. And after I graduated with my master's, I started teaching as an inclusion teacher or special education teacher. So I did that for 6 years, and then last two school years ago, I started becoming a general education teacher at my school for literacy. Um, so yeah, I've been doing this for 16 years and 10 officially as a teacher.
Oh, okay.
It's been a
Do
journey.
you do lesson plans then, or how
Yeah,
do you? Okay,
yeah.
yeah. I haven't done teaching in general education. I taught at University of Phoenix for a couple semesters, not online, but in they had some brick and mortar places,
Okay.
and it was mainly like police ethics, police history, and
Hmm.
for people getting their criminology degree,
Mm.
and learn a lot by teaching. But
Hmm.
the lesson plan definitely helps. And they had a training you had to go through that was about teaching adult learners, which was pretty good. And they had some pretty good tools to use. They did a lot of like writing papers. So they
Hmm.
had Write Point, which was like a more advanced spell check and grammar check, which was pretty good. They had a
Hmm.
plagiarism checker that would put it through everything online and other papers written, which were good tools for a teacher to use. But
Hmm.
I under, I can see how teaching the job extends well outside of the hours that you're teaching. So
Oh
it's
yes. Oh yes. And for me, like even if I'm not doing anything related to teaching, like planning or anything, I could be, you know, out of the club or out of dinner or something like that, and something will cross my mind. It's like, an idea for my kids, and I'm just like, let me send myself an email. Let me look this
mm,
resource up. Let me do this. Like, so it's like a 24/7 job. Like this year, I've had the most dreams about my students than I've ever had in the entire world. And I'm just like, this thing never ends. Like you can take the
mm,
hat off, but it's still gonna be there. It's like that hat that comes off that just keeps, it
mm.
never leaves. It's that picture. It's like hat gone, up, but still there. It's like it never leaves. It's fun.
What are some of the most useful lessons you've learned from teaching then?
Listening to the students.
Mm,
Um, I'm pretty good with body language, reading body language. And so that is the bigger way I listen to the students, not what they say, but like how they enter the space, how they are when I'm teaching, how they are when you know, they're working on something. I'm kind of watching. I'm definitely that helicopter teacher with my eyes all over the room, watching them at all times, like head on swivel. And I tell my kids, I'm not an octopus. I can't do 50 million things at one time, but I can definitely observe a lot at one time.
mm,
And so for me, it's just listening to them because that will teach me, like, that will help me better teach them. So if I see a kid is like kind of just sitting there like lost in the sauce, I'm like, okay, come help me out. And one of the things I do a lot of times, I was telling somebody yesterday, is like I'll intentionally make mistakes when I'm kind of presenting something in front of them so that they can then show that they've learned something. And they're like, you're wrong, you're wrong. I love it. If
mm.
if you're telling me that I'm wrong as a teacher, that means that you have learned something here. Like I really love that. So yeah.
How
And
is Go ahead, sorry.
oh, I was just gonna say, and patience, more
Mm,
patience. Every year I get more patience. And then something else that I learned from a student a few years ago. is the difference between a need and a want. Um, that was something growing up that I had a struggle with. And so there was a moment where she was having a very rough time. Um, and we were just trying to get her, to bring her energy down to re-regulate herself. And people were around her asking her like, what does she want? What does she want? And then I get down in front of her. I'm like, what do you need? And I saw her entire body change. And it was just like, ooh, that's a magical word right there. And she had to
Hmm.
stop and think, what is it that I actually need? Because need is definitely different than a want. And so like that's the word that I have definitely asked my students over and over this year, like, what do you need? And when they come to me, with peer conflicts, I'm like, okay, so what do you need from me? Because you're telling me this for a reason, and I know that you're trusting me to support you. But if you're telling me this, I need to know what your end game is. What do you want from me being involved in the situation? Because otherwise I feel like you can handle this, but you want some support. So what do you need from me? um, and that's helped me kind of like express my needs more as an adult. um, so I really have learned a lot from them. It's amazing how
Nice.
you can learn from
I
children.
think that the need question is a great one for listening, because
Hmm.
that's, if you are trying to listen, then that's what you need you need the other person to communicate.
Hmm.
So then the idea is, what is the need? Hmm. What have you
Exactly.
learned, or what do you think are the most important things for a writer? Like if somebody came to you and like, hey, I got your book, I'm interested in being a writer. What are the, I don't know, I guess we'll go with three because three's good. But what are the three things that you would tell a person that's on their journey of writing is the most important things for a writer to do?
Be open to all ideas. um, I've done improv, and so yes, and there's never a
Hmm.
bad idea. It might not be the one for this piece, but the one for that piece. So just write down what comes to you. Um, this is your work and not somebody else's. So people will give feedback, but at the end of the day, you know what you're supposed to do with your writing. So trust that this is yours, and you know other people can have opinions, but at the end of the day, you have to trust your gut. Um, read.
Hmm.
That's how I've definitely grown as a poet, is reading more poetry. Um, and that's something that uh, I was at a workshop on publishing a couple of weeks ago, and it was a poet, Kwame Alexander, who was kind of facilitating it. And so people were asking like, how do you grow as a writer and for poetry? And he was like, you read. Like you can't. You have to kind of. I feel like that's where some of my inspiration comes from, because uh, I definitely didn't have a lot in me as poetry. It just, like I said, it just kind of started coming during the pandemic, and so uh, once I kind of buckled down in reading more poetry, and reading just more stories, uh, the creativity has flowed more than ever in writing. So reading is key to the writing process.
I wonder if that's because it helps you connect with the creativity more. Like if creativity is that thing that's out there and it's reaching out and trying to find avenues to express itself, that by reading poetry or essays or whatever it is that you're interested in writing, or maybe just reading in general,
Hmm.
that that creative thing sees that and is like, okay, now I can use these pathways
Hmm.
to connect a little better. Or maybe it's also for the person that's doing the reading to be able to understand those messages better, those
Yep.
feelings, and
Yep.
be able to say, oh, well, this is important. Like that's a good line that I read and I like it. And now this
Mm-hmm.
thing that's occurring is a good line and I
Mm-hmm.
should write it down.
Mm-hmm. Because like I know how there are poets who will take a line from a poem that they've read and then start it that way and then let it flow from there. And I like that. So that's something I definitely want to tap into as well. Um, and then the concept of rewriting a poem, but in your own way. Um, that's also a concept that I like.
Hmm.
Yeah.
What's your with your publishing? What was that like? Like, how did you publish?
It was scary initially. Um, so I knew that I wanted to. Initially, I wanted to try and have the book published and out before the start of the school year last year, um, and that did not happen. So that was kind of the scary part for me because it's like I had a date goal to get this done, get it out. Um, but I have I knew what site I wanted to use, so I used a site that another buddy of mine used for his poetry book, um, and I got started with it, and I kind of had my cover design for the book, started putting the table of contents together, and then I just was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. So I stopped. Like I just stopped one day, and then one day I was like, I was writing some affirmations. I was like, my affirmation was, I'm going to be publishing a poetry book by the end of 2023. It was like, oh, we're December. I think I might need to pick up the pace on this process.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did the getting myself away from distractions. Like when I have a deadline and I need to like buckle down, I definitely put myself in a space away from distractions because that's my issue is like things like if staying in my apartment. I'm gonna be distracted because I can be on the bed, I can be on my phone, I can watch TV, I can eat something. So I just went downstairs to the lounge area, took my laptop, my books and stuff, and went went to town on publishing the stuff or putting it all together in the book, and that's when it really kind of came to fruition. I didn't finish it that day because I just got tired after looking at the screen for like 3 hours, but that helped me move along in the publishing process, to put it all together, and then I just put the send button. Like this book was not so my poetry book is just 17 poems because it's like I need to just get something out there into the universe. Um, and so and 17 is my favorite number. So that's why I chose 17. But I I um I didn't have anybody else look at what I had done, and I wish I had because things like my page numbers were off, and I got the final copy, uh, the first printed copy, and I said, "Oh, these page numbers are off. Oh well." It was just me doing it. I didn't have an editor, so like I'm not mad at that. You know, it wasn't that far off. The page numbers, and then I didn't put like the titles on the of the poems on the page because I just didn't have the space for it. Uh, but I said, you know what? People are gonna get what they got at this point because it is finished. So
Did you?
yeah.
Which service did you use for that? Did you use Amazon KDP?
I used Blurb, which then ran through Amazon.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then the software is called Bookright.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I'm
so
familiar with
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Have you used? Have you tried Amazon KDP, Kindle Direct
N-
Publishing?
no, I haven't.
I would recommend that. My first
Okay.
book I did through a self-publishing house. They
Hmm.
call it a vanity press, which
Okay.
is basically the the customer is the writer because you're going to pay for that service. And I think that first book was like $900 after everything of getting it. Like I write it, send it to them,
Hmm.
and then they do all the stuff. I'm not sure how much of the stuff they did, but like blocking it so it fits on the page and
Uh-huh.
doing the page numbers and setting it up, and then they send you a proof to look at. And then I used Amazon's. book publishing thing. It's on-demand publishing, the KDP. So you can do a soft cover. Now you can do a hardcover, I think,
Okay.
and they also have the Kindle part, so you can do the e-reader.
Okay.
And I've done, I think, 6 books on KDP
Mm-hmm.
and 3 or 4 poetry books, and then some other novels.
Mm-hmm.
And that program is the best I've ever used. It's gotten
Okay.
better since I started using it in 2014, 2015. It's gotten a whole lot better. And you have your own authors page you can put on Amazon that has all your books on there.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that, it doesn't cost anything for you to do that.
Okay.
And when you publish your book, it doesn't cost you anything. Amazon gets paid a certain amount for every copy
Mm-hmm.
sold, and it's on demand, and you get to select the price for it to a
Mm-hmm.
certain extent. Like there's a
Mm-hmm.
minimum price it has to meet, and then you
Right.
get the royalties from it. They just put
Mm-hmm.
into your bank account.
Mm-hmm.
You have to register your bank account on there.
Yep.
And that learning that is a process that I understand what you're talking about of the look, they're just going to get what they got because, this is what I've done.
Yep.
And that can happen on KDP, but then you can come back to it later and fix
Okay.
all those things, and you can
Okay.
fix them easily. You don't have to go through a company. Like
Okay.
that's what I did the first time. If you're reading it and you see a couple mistakes and you go, I didn't see this before. They didn't see it. So I'd like it to get changed. You got to go through this whole thing through another company. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
using a company and software that then goes through Amazon, just my recommendation would be cut that out
Mm-hmm.
and just do it on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get an ISBN number through Amazon. You get the
Mm-hmm.
Amazon number with it. You can't use an Amazon generated ISBN number to then go publish it somewhere else under that
Mm-hmm.
ISBN. That's Amazon's number to
Mm-hmm.
assign to you. But then when you get into the world of ISBN numbers, we should be taking shots every time I say ISBN. When you get into the world of ISBN numbers, you start to go, oh, well, this is a shady place. Like you can get official ones, and then you can get them from brokers if you don't want to buy 100 or 10 or whatever the minimum is that you have to buy. But then you're like, well, is this a real number or is it not? I mean, you could get fake numbers, and it's easy to get taken in the world of publishing because the customer is you, the writer. So you're going to get calls from other people saying, we'd like to turn this into a book, or we'd like to publish this. We'd like to turn it into a movie. We'd like to turn it into a TV show. In the first few calls you get of that, you're like, wow, what luck, what luck. And then you're like, oh, this is just calls I get all the time now. Right? I'll get 10 to 20 of those calls a month. So you got to be careful for all the scams. And then if you do it yourself through KDP, through learning that, you already know all that. So all that mystery is gone, and you can work on it a little and then come back to it later, or you can get it all done, put it out there. And then if you see problems with it, come back and fix it.
Yeah.
But it is easy to get to the point where you're like, I'm just putting it out there, page numbers in the wrong place, no titles, doesn't matter. It's out there now. And you could feel like that on Amazon, and you could publish it like that. But then the next day, the next week, you could go, well, let me just touch that up a little. And you learn the program a little better and you fix it. Highly recommend Amazon. I don't get paid anything from Amazon other than the royalties for books, but what a great program they have. I've never been published, like a publishing house come in and go, hey, we love it, we're going to take care of everything. I've never had that happen. So I don't have that experience to talk about. Like, I'm sure Stephen King has a different publishing experience than a lot of other people. John Grisham, things like that. So I would recommend looking at the Amazon, especially if you're doing a company that goes through Amazon. And if you're dealing with a self-publishing house that just publishes it through Amazon, like another just regular person that is helping you use Amazon, cut that out and just use it, do it yourself, and you'll appreciate it much more. You'll have much more insight. It'll seem like it's difficult, but Amazon's got programs for making your cover, whether you want to do it 100% yourself or you want to use their format, or picking the book size, picking the paper, picking all that stuff is you choose it. It's pretty great. That
Okay.
made my publishing stuff a lot better, and you get samples of it so you can look at it before you release it, so you can
Mhm.
go, "Oh, I didn't notice this when I did it online, but now I notice it in when I have this book in my hands."
Yeah.
And then you can also do it with, when you're looking at it on a Kindle or any other e-reader, you can go, "Oh, well, this page break isn't correct. I need to correct that." And you can just go in
Mhm.
and correct it that quick.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
yeah, recommend that.
Okay. Appreciate that.
It takes a little bit of the madness out of publishing.
Yeah.
Hmm. Have
I
you
think
done any, like, poetry readings, book signings, or anything like that?
not yet. That is something I'm working on this summer. The teaching the school year just really like zapped so
Mhm.
much energy out of me. Also singing in a chorus. I was like, I'm gonna organize all that in the summertime. So yeah, that's literally what my summer is this book, and trying to do as much as possible with it. So yeah,
What's your number of poetry or poems that you're gonna aim
for
for your next book?
I'm not sure. Um, I'm very big into like numbers being connected to something.
Mhm.
And so I know the theme is, and so I'm just trying to think of what number I want to have based off of the theme. Because there's two options of numbers, and so I'm I'm definitely leaning to the first one, which is like would be 54. Um,
Okay.
but the other option would be I think 68. So yeah.
You can also put pictures in. I think
Hmm.
that helps. Like, so if you have a poem and you were in nature or you saw something that reminded you of it, whether it has to do with a poem specifically or
Yeah.
just reminds you of it, you can take a picture of it and you can put
Hmm.
that in the books. Easy to do
That's
on
true.
Amazon as well.
That's
Maybe
true.
harder in other places, but then that'll take up your pages a little more when you're thinking about formatting. Like,
Yeah.
one of the questions I had was, do I want a poem to start on the left side or the right side? Or does it
Mm.
matter to me? And then after
Hmm.
the title page, where you have, publishing dates and all that, do you want the next page to be the poem? Do you want it to be the right side? And then if you have a poem that is short, do you want to put two poems on the same page?
Hmm.
Mm. And then if you have a picture or a blank space because you have a poem that's two pages and you put it on one page and you turn the next, then do you want a blank page or a picture? Those
Hmm.
are all things to think about for page numbers. I
Yeah.
understand. I get where you're coming from on the importance of numbers, but I mean, think about that as far as you're publishing your final manuscript. If you want to do pictures, if you want to do blank pages, because sometimes I think it's important to have, if it's a poem that is uh, powerful or whatever, meaningful to you, I wouldn't want it to share the opening with another poem because I don't want
Hmm.
to take away from the other poem, but
Hmm.
I also want to give that poem space to read or space to breathe.
Yeah.
So, and then you could also do like a poetry, like interactive activity type book where you leave space for people to use it as a book where they can write poetry in as well.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
that's interesting.
Hmm.
So it's maybe that's the advantage of reading a bunch of other poetry books and just seeing how they're set up.
Yeah.
Because I think I think I have four poetry books, and three of them don't have a table of contents. Just because I was like, nah, you just got to experience it as you go through it.
Yeah.
And I think my idea for that changes now to where I think maybe it would be nice to have a table of contents. And on the e-reader, it's a table of contents because you can go straight to it. It's different
Yeah.
than flipping through. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's some of the fun part of publishing is going through all that. It seems
Yeah.
like a grind, but it's also that presentation of all that work you put into it. So I think it's valuable to put time and thought into it.
Definitely.
But having a shorter poetry book with like 17 poems, I like that. But I think they call those a pamphlet or something else. I think there's a specific name for that type of book.
Okay. Hmm.
But I like it. I think it's
Yeah.
it's and then it comes to, well, how long should a poem be? How do you figure that for your poems? Is it just the thought's done, or do you look at them and think, well, that's only 4 lines, that's not enough?
When the thought is done. Yeah,
Mm,
because I had a couple of recently that I was just like, "Is that it?" But I'm like,
mm,
"Actually, yeah, that's all that needs to be said." Because I've looked at other poems and, like, great poets, and there's a 4 lines. Like, if
mhm.
that's your thought, that's the thought. And that's the creative thought in that space. It doesn't have to be super long. And I've also, like, looked at poems and like, "Why is it so long? Because 'Cause I'm not getting anything out of this." So,
Yeah.
like, I think if it's for me, like, also some poems, the way they're stylized, which I like, the person that helped edit my poems, like, he definitely helped with, like, okay, this should be, the word here or space here and then moved over to the middle. So, like, I like that concept of, like,
Mm,
painting a picture with the poem as well. Because
mhm.
that's not something I had in mind initially. Because I struggle sometimes with, like, seeing things artistically. Uh, that's why I don't do, like, a lot of painting or drawing and stuff. That is my weakest area in art, uh, for sure. But uh, being the thing, I, I I feel it and I can. It's up here, but seeing it, I struggle with that. But yeah, I definitely don't think that it has to be super long. It doesn't have to be super short. It's just whatever that thought is done. That bubble is popped.
Yeah, I agree. And then with maybe the painting side, you just got to connect with that type of creativity. That doesn't mean you have to, but if you ever
Yeah,
wanted to, I
yeah.
imagine anyone could connect with any type of creativity if they wanted to. Some's
Hmm.
going to be better than others. It might be,
Hmm.
well, better. It might be different than others. It might not be like an impressionist work. It might
Hmm.
be more abstract, but I think
Hmm.
it's still going to say something. So
Yeah.
that's interesting. What's the best way for people to get a copy of your book and to follow what you do in the future?
Amazon is where my book is. It's called
Okay.
My First 17. Um, and then to get in touch with me or following me, definitely on social media. So my Instagram is Son of Howard, um, SONOFHOWARD.
Okay.
This
I
is
think I
the
have a couple other.
cover to the
Nice.
book.
I
Yeah.
like the colors on that. That's good.
So,
Hmm, very nice. I think I have your copies for or your links for Instagram and a couple of other of your WordPress
oh
places
yeah.
and your YouTube for the links will be in the show notes. So if anybody
Okay.
wants to check those out, they can.
Cool. Smooth.
And best of luck in your next book coming out. That's
Thank
exciting.
you.
It's exciting
Thank you.
stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you very much for your time here today. Do you have any thoughts in closing or anything you want to talk about that we didn't?
Go capture the creativity. I like that. Like when you that that's what I'm gonna do today. Go outside,
Hmm,
capture some creativity. Yeah,
nice.
I really like that.
All right. That's good stuff. I'll talk to you on the other side of this musical exit.
All right.